All right, so you want to knit a sweater. I get it. Everybody wants to knit sweaters. It's awesome. Once you start, you never look back. But you chose a sweater and then there's alterations you want to make. Today, I will talk to you about the top 5 alterations that you can and maybe even should make on a sweater. And then I'll talk to you about my top alterations that I would actually not attempt. The first thing that I actually always alter in a sweater is the length. The length of everything, all the time, everywhere. Because when you buy a pattern, yes, the designer has put a certain length to knit, and that's just to give you some sort of an idea of where the pattern should hit on your body in order to achieve the look that you see on the picture. But ultimately, your body is not the same length as the designer's body. It's not the same length as a standard size. So there's really no reason why you should blindly follow the length of a sweater. I'm talking about the length of the body, but I'm also talking about the length of the arms. So what I do when I buy a pattern, I choose if I would like to have a cropped version, a long version. I decide the length of the sleeves that I want, and then I take my own measurements. I choose from my own measurements, and then I just basically knit until I'm satisfied with the length. It is obviously much easier to do this with a pattern that has zero shaping. So if you're basically knitting a rectangle for your body, then it's really easy because there's no waist shaping, hip shaping, any of that. Same thing for the sleeves. If there's no shaping, you're just basically knitting a long tube that doesn't have any decreases. Then you just, do the ribbing when you're ready to do it. If there are decreases and increases in the body, you'll have to adjust where you put them. And that is absolutely okay. That's actually my second thing that I would consider changing in patterns is where you put the shaping. So if there is body shaping, it typically will go in for the waist and then it'll go out for the hips, or maybe it won't go in for the waist. It's gonna start going out right away for an A shape. You can always choose to put less, more, to place it in different places in order to fit your body type. So really, the only things you have to consider is how long you're going to be knitting that sweater. So see point number 1, and then how much width do you want to add or subtract, and then where does that hit on your own body? And you want to make sure that you're decreasing to the narrowest point of your body by starting earlier, and maybe increasing to the biggest part of your body by starting earlier as well. So let's say you want to add 3 rounds of shaping in your entire sweater. You'll have to measure how many inches you have in order to put those increases, and then divide that by 3 sections so you know when to add your increases. I'm not going to go into details on which kind of increases or decreases you can add, but just so you know, it can be very simple if you have a sweater that has a simple pattern. Obviously, if you're going into color work, into cables, into different things, that it might add a level of complexity that you're not ready to do just yet. But if you're choosing something simple, it should be very easy to add or subtract shaping. Same goes for the sleeves. When a designer like this one here, I hope you can see, there are decreases in this sleeve, and they have been placed a certain length apart in order to achieve a very subtle decrease line. If I make my sleeves shorter, I'm gonna have to change a little bit the speed at which I'm decreasing. If I'm lengthening the arms, then I'll have to adjust and put my increases a little bit farther apart. So all those things come from measuring yourself, using math to approach a math problem, and then you can start altering it for your own body. Third thing that is absolutely super easy and can be very fun is to play with color. You can always add stripes to a basic stockinette stitch sweater. You can always add color block. You could play with doing all the ribbing in a different color than the body. You could even add some intarsia if you're feeling very adventurous. Playing with color is something that's going to change your basic stockinette stitch raglan into a striped sweater. And that's just so much more punchy, isn't it? I'm not saying that it's bad to be wearing a plain sweater. I'm wearing one right now, but if you're like me, sometimes it's fun to add a bit of color and stripes to everything. Just do it. If you'd like to do stripes, there's no need to buy a pattern that calls for stripes. Just add it to a basic plain stockinette stitch pattern. 4 is the actual yarn you're using for the pattern. It can be a little bit daunting to try and figure out which yarn to use for which pattern when you're not using the one that the designer's calling for, but it's part of the process. And I barely ever use the yarn called for in the pattern because I want to go find something maybe that's more local to me. Maybe it's something more within my budget. Maybe it's something that I want to find in my own stash. There are plenty of reasons why you wouldn't want to use the yarn that's, recommended by the pattern designer. And the only thing that you have to be very careful about is 1, the yarn weight. So making sure that you're choosing the correct size of yarn for that sweater. And 2, trying to find fibers that are within the same category of fiber. Meaning if it is animal fiber and it's a non-superwash animal fiber sweater, you know that if you choose a non-superwash animal fiber, you might get similar results. But then if you change completely and go for like a cotton yarn, the result won't be the same. Obviously, knowing how fibers behave is part of the tricky part of substituting things. That's why there are websites that are dedicated entirely to that. So if you go on yarnsub.com, you will get yarns that are very similar. You'll type in the yarn that you're looking for a substitution for, and then it'll tell you a bunch of other yarns that could be suitable to what you're trying to achieve. I've made my mistakes. Obviously, I've chosen some yarns that were not appropriate for a pattern, and unfortunately, you might have to go through that as well. That's part of learning. But if you go do your research first, like I said, Yarn Sub, or even go on Ravelry and go check what people have used to make this exact pattern, you will most likely find options that are going to be suitable for you in a different yarn. And lastly, there are some techniques that you can absolutely swap or alter in a pattern. Meaning, if you want to use a different cast on method, go for it. If you want to use a different bind off method, go for it. If you want to use a different types of increases or decreases, go for it. As long as you know what result you're going to get. So if you're switching a long tail cast on instead of a tubular cast on, hopefully, that you will get a different look than the pattern is achieving. And as long as you know what that difference is, it does not matter. Same thing goes for types of short rows, German short rows, Japanese short rows, wrap and turn, shadow wraps. They are all valid methods of doing exactly the same thing. And you can choose the one that you prefer as long as you understand the construction of it and how it will change maybe the numbers here and there. The last alteration that I consider to be quite easy is if you would like to change a pattern from knitting flat in pieces to knitting in the round, or the opposite, knitting in the round to knitting flat pieces. You basically have to know that when we're knitting flat, we're then going to be seaming the 2 sides of the sweater. So when we're seaming, there are 1 stitch on both sides, on either sides, that are going to be tucked in inside the seam. So basically on a full body that has 2 pieces, there are going to be 4 stitches that are casted on in order to be eaten up by the seam. So if you're taking a flat knitted piece and you're putting it in the round, you're going to have to subtract those 4 stitches. And the opposite is true. If you're taking in the round pattern and putting it flat, you're going to have to add those 4 extra stitches one on either side of both panels. You also will probably have to think about how to center a design if there is a design in that sweater, to make sure that when you're taking out stitches or putting in stitches, you're not putting that design off center. And you're going to also have to make sure that you understand how to do the reverse action, meaning that if your pattern asks you to do certain techniques on the right side and then they're telling you what to do on the wrong side, you have to flip that wrong side to what do I do on the front if I'm never going to work that wrong side on the wrong side. So it's absolutely doable. It's not a big, difficult change, in my opinion. Same thing goes for knitting a cardigan in the round versus back and forth. All you have to do is be willing to cut your sweater, which is an advanced technique. And personally, once you know how to do it, it is a very simple change. We might have to do an entire video on that technique called steeking, if that's something that interests you. Now let's talk about things that I personally would not try to change. There are so many patterns to choose from on Ravelry or the internet in general that I feel like you can absolutely find a sweater that will fit into the category of I like this, this, and this, and I can make those changes, the one I just talked about, in order to achieve a sweater that I love, but I would have to change something very difficult about it. Hopefully I'm making sense. So let's say you find a sweater and you love everything about it except the shape of the neck, like the neckline and shoulder shaping, those two things, shaping, like intense what makes the sweater shaping, meaning the type of sweater it is. Is it a drop shoulder, raglan, yoke sweater, contiguous sleeve sweater? Those things won't make sense to change. If you like the pattern of something but you don't like that it's a raglan, I would say go find the shape that you want and then apply the pattern to the shape that you want. Yes, you'll have to buy two different patterns and try to mash them together, but it's gonna be much simpler. Same thing goes for the neckline. If you like a round neckline, but the pattern you found has a V-shaped neckline, it's going to be very difficult to change it from one to the other because you'll have to make a bunch of calculations based on your row gauge and when to join in the round for the body, etc. I would just not even consider it, except if it means changing just the opening size, meaning if you want a closer to the neck versus a little bit wider round neck, there are options. You can cast on for a smaller size and then augment to your size in order to make it closer. You can do the opposite, where if you want a neckline that's still the same shape but a little bit wider, you can cast on for a bigger size first and then start knitting and then stop at your smaller size. That's absolutely possible, but don't try and change the entire structure of that sweater, or else you're just gonna it might work, but you might also be in a world of pain, and I don't wish that for you. Second thing, same thing, it's the gauge at which the sweater is knitted. All the numbers in that pattern have been calculated based on that gauge. It is the gauge that the designer chose to use in order to create what they created, and they based all of their calculations on that number. So if you want to change the gauge in a very dramatic way, you're basically creating a new pattern. And we've seen designers do that. We've seen designers come out with two patterns that are very similar, and you're thinking, what the hell? Why is that a new pattern? Isn't it exactly the same as the other? The difference might be the gauge. And they're releasing an entirely new pattern for that gauge because it takes that much time to figure out. So unless you're feeling very adventurous and you think that you're able to design it yourself, I wouldn't try and change the gauge drastically. So if you're wanting to knit a sweater in worsted weight yarn, go find a pattern in worsted weight yarn and then maybe change a few different little things. Much easier. And then the last thing is changing the direction of the knitting, meaning if the sweater is top down versus bottom up, they are different techniques. You could possibly figure it out and like switch it around and rewrite the thing to make sense. But again, you're rewriting something. So it's going to take a little bit of time and fussing about to try and figure out how to switch a pattern top down to bottom up and bottom up to top down. Not impossible, but maybe a little bit difficult. So there you go. Those are my alterations that I get asked about all the time. And sometimes I tell people, go for it. It's absolutely worth it. And sometimes I have to say, well, that's a pass for me. If you learned a little something, please consider subscribing or giving me a thumbs up. That is absolutely much appreciated. And I will see you next time. Happy knitting.